If you're struggling to find out how many downloads a podcast gets per month or per episode, you're not alone. Yes, some shows will put these stats on their website, but most of them don't. And even if they do, downloads are often just not the best measure of popularity. By the end of this video, you'll understand why it's so difficult to check a podcast's download numbers and discover an alternative that's much more helpful. So first off, we need to understand just how podcasts work. Every podcast is published on what we call a podcast hosting platform. This is where the audio files and all the important stuff like episode titles and descriptions are stored. Basically, it's the podcast's home, right? So from there, the show is pushed out to podcast directories like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And these apps don't actually host the podcast themselves. They just pull the content from the hosting platform using something called an RSS feed. Now, because podcasts are available on so many different platforms, naturally, they're downloaded across all of them too. And the problem is, most of these platforms don't share this sort of data publicly. So even if a podcast is super popular, it's really hard to know exactly how many downloads it gets, unless you're the host or producer looking at the private stats. There's one exception to this, and that's something called OP3. If a podcast host adds an OP3 prefix to their RSS feed, it tracks downloads across all the major platforms and makes the data public. Not many podcasts use it, but when they do, it can be really, really useful. Okay, so a quick thing to keep in mind is that a download doesn't always mean someone actually listened. When someone subscribes to a podcast, new episodes often just download automatically, whether they plan to listen to it or not. Other times, someone might just download an episode if it looks interesting, but then forget about it. Either way, the download doesn't tell you if someone listened. So yeah, downloads are useful, but they just don't tell the whole story. If you want to know how many people are actually tuning in, then listener numbers are actually more helpful. That's why at Rephonic, instead of focusing on downloads, we provide listeners per episode and monthly listenership. Because if you're thinking about pitching a show as a guest or a sponsor, having a gauge of how many times you or your client is actually going to be heard by listeners is going to help you decide if it's worth pitching. I've put a link down below to Rephonic's free trial if you want to see how many listeners a podcast has. Or you can take a look at this next video where I'll walk you through 4 other ways to gauge the popularity of a podcast on top of using Rephonic. I'll catch you next time.